Let's start talking about how muscles get the energy they need. This diagram, I like it. I think it's a pretty good one. Imagine that you're sitting at home, just having fun, doing your normal things, and suddenly a chupacabra comes through the front door. You now have to run for your life. So what's going to happen is, for maybe 10 seconds or so, different sources have slightly different times. Don't worry too much about exact times here. For a few seconds, you have a system called the Phosphagen System that can create instantaneous ATP. But that only will work for a few seconds. After a few seconds, you're going to use up the Phosphagen System. It's going to be spent. At that point, you can switch over to glycolysis. Glycolysis can make ATP pretty quickly. It's not very efficient, though. Every molecule of glucose gives you only 2 ATPs. And what's going to happen is, after, here you see in the diagram, 40 seconds, maybe up to a couple of minutes or thereabouts, you're going to start generating a lot of lactic acid. Lactic acid is toxic, and as the lactic acid builds up, initially you can convert it to pyruvate and use that in aerobic respiration, but eventually you're going to build up so much lactic acid that you can't do that. And you get that lactic acid burn, in your muscles and stuff. And after a couple of minutes or so, you're done. The glycolysis can no longer be the main way for you to get to ATP. And at that point, you have to switch to aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is very efficient. You get 36 or thereabouts, depends on how you count them, ATPs for each molecule of glucose. The drawback is that it's very slow. So basically, look as you go from the phosphagen system to glycogen, glycolysis, to aerobic respiration. It gets more and more efficient, but it gets slower and slower. Now, when you're sitting out there right now at home, right now, just, farting and thinking about sex, you're doing aerobic respiration right now. It's when you need sudden energy that you have to switch over to the phosphagen system and glycolysis. And it's not as though you always have to go in that order or that you can't go back. The way I think about it is, like, let's say when I'm out riding my bike. I'm riding along a flat surface. I'm riding at a constant speed. I'm in aerobic respiration at that point, all right? I'm doing aerobic respiration, every molecule of glucose giving me 30-some ATPs. Then let's say I come to a hill, and I want to sprint a little bit. A lot of times on hills, I like to initially pick up my speed and get going faster to start me up the bottom of the hill, because I know that as I go up the hill, I'm eventually going to slow down. It's going to get harder and harder. So I might switch over to the glycolysis, the glycogen lactic acid system, in order to give me an extra little burst of energy. And then what will happen is, as I go up the hill, that glycogen system will last me for a few seconds, but then I start getting that lactic acid burn. Lactic acid also works in the brain to give you that feeling of fatigue. So partway up the hill, I have to slow down, and I go back into aerobic respiration again. And when I go back into aerobic respiration, then my body can start to clear away some of that lactic acid, and then I'll have the capability of using the glycolysis again when I need it, okay? And if suddenly a dog comes out of nowhere and starts to bite at my calves, which has happened to me in the past, then that phosphagen system can give me, about 10 seconds of immediate burst of speed to get away from that dog. So you can constantly go back and forth in between these. It's just that, each one, as the phosphagen and the glycolysis, once you use them, it takes a while to replenish them. So that's what's going on here. You're constantly moving back between different sources of energy. It has to do with how quick they can make ATP and how long they can last. Aerobic respiration can last indefinitely, basically, as long as you're, awake and alive and you've eaten enough food to have the raw materials for making ATP. So skeletal muscle tissue needs an enormous amount of energy to produce the power stroke, keep the calcium pumps working. ATP, energy currency of the muscle. We know that muscle fibers get ATP in 3 ways, and we're going to break those down and look at them individually. So the phosphagen system gives you just a few seconds of ATP, but it's immediate. Anaerobic fermentation, which is glycolysis, feeds into that, less than 2 minutes. And then aerobic respiration basically gives you indefinite energy. You can keep going at a steady pace, basically forever. All right. Let's look at the phosphagen system first. It's very clever what's going on. For sudden bursts of activity, muscles need energy faster than it can be made by glycolysis or aerobic respiration. Two mechanisms used to create ATP quickly, and those are called the phosphagen system. So look at myokinase. Look at what's happening here. You can take a molecule of ADP. Myokinase grabs one of those P's, grabs one of the phosphates. What do we end up with then? We end up with adenosine monophosphate because we took one of the two phosphates off of adenosine diphosphate. And then what myokinase can do is it can take that phosphate and stick it onto a different ADP and change that ADP into an ATP. See, isn't that clever? It's kind of like taking money out of the pocket on the left side of your pants and putting it into the pocket on the right side of your pants. You don't really gain anything overall. You still have the same amount of money, but the money's now in a different place, and now pickpockets will be able to steal from your right side instead of your left side. And that's kind of what myokinase is doing. You've got two ADPs, notice, all right? So look at the top. You've got two ADP molecules out there. Well, those are the uncharged form of ATP, right? So neither one of those can give you energy. So myokinase says, here's what we'll do. We'll steal one of those phosphates from an ADP, stick it onto another ADP, and now we end up with an ATP and an AMP. But the ATP, at least, we can use to give us immediate energy in that muscle. So that's myokinase. And then there's creatine kinase. So look on the left hand, or look at the bottom, sorry, of that diagram on the left, that illustration. So creatine phosphate, okay, so notice creatine, it comes from your diet. You eat food, you get creatine. Your body can take a phosphate and stick it onto creatine, making creatine phosphate. And creatine phosphate ends up being a way to sort of store energy. ATP, the molecule ATP, doesn't have a good shelf life, all right? So it doesn't last long. So what you can do is you can take a phosphate off of ATP and stick it onto creatine and make a creatine phosphate. Well, then what creatine kinase can do is it can steal that phosphate off of creatine phosphate, attach it to an ADP, and therefore make ATP. So that is creatine phosphate system. Notice that'll work for a while, but eventually you're going to use up all those creatine phosphates, aren't you? And that's when you run out of the phosphagen system, when there are no more creatine phosphates to steal a phosphate from. But at least for a few seconds, that will give you ATPs. So, see, creatine functions as an ATP storage mechanism. Every molecule of creatine phosphate is converted to a molecule of adenosine triphosphate. So there you see, I wrote the equations out for you. Take two ADPs, myokinase can steal from one and give to the other, all right? And then notice with creatine, you when you're at rest right now, you can add phosphates to creatine. Creatine kinase can do that, making creatine phosphate. And then later, when you need sudden energy, creatine kinase can grab the phosphate off of a creatine phosphate, stick it onto an ADP, then you make an ATP, and you reduce creatine phosphate back to the original creatine. So notice basically the bottom half of that chemical equation is what you're doing when you need immediate energy. And then the top half is when, you know, the crisis is over, you're back at rest. Now you can go ahead and start adding phosphates to creatine again. So that's the phosphagen system. Gives you instant energy because all you have to do is transfer a phosphate from one molecule to another. The problem with that is within a few seconds you basically use all that up. You use up all the ADPs and the creatine phosphates you got, and then you're done. There's no more you can't steal phosphates from anybody anymore after a few seconds. So looking then at the other two systems here, anaerobic fermentation creates ATP in the absence of oxygen. So you know, for a sudden sprint you can't get oxygen fast enough, okay? And so what you can do is you can use glycolysis, take glucose from glycogen and from the blood, and you get two ATPs. That produces pyruvic acid and lactic acid. Now, pyruvic acid can be pumped right into aerobic respiration, so that's good. But lactic acid has to be converted to pyruvic acid. And when the lactic acid builds up, that's what causes the trouble. Lactic acid is, to some extent, toxic. So that's why there's a limited amount of time that you can use this anaerobic system, all right? Once you build up too much lactic acid, you're done. And usually after a couple of minutes, you're done. You have to then switch over to aerobic respiration. Uses oxygen and 1 molecule of glucose to get 36 ATPs. That takes place in the mitochondria, and it just takes time, all right? It takes longer. It's not nearly as fast. Uses pyruvic acid from anaerobic fermentation, so it can use that as well. So that's why that pyruvic acid is fine as a byproduct from glycolysis. The lactic acid is not. And remember, produces carbon dioxide, water, and heat. That's why when you exercise, you warm up. Your body gets warmer. That's why you sweat, generating all that heat. Okay? So here's a summary of the 3 systems. The phosphagen system on the left, the anaerobic pathway, and then the aerobic pathway. So 3 ways, and it's not as though you always have to use one, then the next one, then the next one. You can, like on my bicycle example, I'm constantly going back and forth between all 3 of those, just depending on the situation. And here's a nice little diagram too, showing, pulling oxygen out of the blood, putting CO2 into the blood, pulling glucose out of the blood. Notice you can anaerobic glycolysis, you get the pyruvate. The lactic acid gets dumped back into the blood. That's going to cause some trouble. And then you can see the creatine phosphate up there. And then down in the mitochondria, we have the oxidative phosphorylation, the electron transport chain, aerobic respiration. You learned all this in Bio 156, so this should be kind of review. Just go over it. Just make sure you have a basic idea of how those 3 systems can be used to make ATP. Now then, look at that picture on the upper right. Have you ever noticed after you get done exercising, what do? Yeah, you look kind of like that. I mean, think about it. Have you ever exercised really hard and you're running or you're cycling and you're like, and then the moment you stop, do you immediately go, and you're back to normal? No. You generally tend to breathe hard for a while even after you're done exercising. What the hell is up with that? Well, that's called oxygen deficit, is the informal name for that. Let's take a look at what's going on. So following cardiovascular exertion, there's a period of increased consumption of oxygen. In other words, you continue to breathe hard after you exercise for, a minute or 2, or depending on how long and how hard. You continue to breathe hard for a while. Technically known as EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, informally called oxygen deficit or oxygen debt. Just means you breathe hard after you exercise. So what's going on? Well, a lot of things. You have to replenish your creatine phosphate and your ATP, all right? So you used up those creatine phosphates, they turn back into creatine. Well, now you have to put phosphates back onto creatine. That takes energy, and so you continue to breathe hard because that's how you get oxygen. Remember, making energy in aerobic respiration, you need oxygen and glucose to make ATP. Also, you have to resynthesize your glycogen. So remember, glycogen, the stored form of glucose in your skeletal muscles and in your liver. When you exercise, you use a bunch of that up. Well, now that you're done, you stopped running or cycling or whatever, stopped doing jumping jacks or whatever, now it's time to resynthesize all that glycogen and build your glycogen reserves back up. Well, that takes energy, so you continue to breathe hard to make sure you get enough oxygen to do that. Reoxygenation of myoglobin. Remember, I said the 2 things about the sarcoplasm of muscle cells that made it kind of unique compared to the sarcoplasm of most cells? Yeah, a lot of glycogen, a lot of myoglobin. That's because muscles need that right there inside the muscle. So after you're done exercising, you've used a bunch of that up, so you need to replenish it. Replenish that glycogen and replenish that myoglobin, reoxygenate it. And so you have to continue to breathe hard to get plenty of oxygen to do that. And then likewise, you got to convert that lactic acid to pyruvate. That lactic acid all build up, convert it back to pyruvate, and once again, it just takes, oxygen and energy to do that. So No big deal here. Oxygen deficit. Yeah, after you're done exercising, you continue to breathe hard for a while. Notice in the lower right, dogs, animals do it as well. So it's the same mechanism, okay? So that's all there is to it. Nothing mysterious. You just need to do all those things in the lower left there. You need to basically replenish, go back to starting position, and it takes a lot of oxygen to do that. Okay, so let's talk about how muscles can generate different amounts of muscle tension, basically different amounts of force. So think about, you're going to pick up something that doesn't weigh very much, like an orange, or you're going to, pick up, the battery for your car, the battery for your car weighs a lot more than an orange does. How does your body generate, when you pick up an orange, you generate only, you need a small amount of muscle tension, a small amount of force. Pick up the battery, you need more. How is it that your body can create differing amounts of muscle tension to get different amounts of force to deal with things that require, different amounts of weight and force and so on? Well, you might think, okay, so if you need more power to a muscle, use a bigger action potential. Turns out all action potentials are the same size, so that doesn't work. Well, the force of a single muscle fiber's contraction depends on the number of action potentials. So think about, again, a single muscle fiber, a single muscle cell. If we send one action potential in 1 second, then we'll get one contraction. But what if we send 10 action potentials in a second? As it turns out, we'll see coming up in an illustration, we can produce what's called wave summation. The contraction of the muscle fiber builds on the previous contraction. So the number of action potentials per second can generate increasing amounts of tension within the muscle. All right. So again, a single muscle fiber picking up something light, you might need only 1 action potential per second. Going to pick up something heavier, 10 action potentials per second. Okay. We'll see this in a diagram coming up. But remember right now, this is the way you can generate differing amount of tension for a single muscle fiber. But then there's another way that your body can do this, really 2 more ways. So the force of an entire muscle's contraction. So now not a single muscle fiber, but an entire muscle generating different amounts of tension or of contraction in an entire muscle. There are 2 ways. The number of motor units recruited and the size of the motor unit. So motor units we haven't talked about before. Let's talk about motor units right now. So look in the diagram on the right. Notice how you see motor unit 1, motor unit 2. Look at motor unit 1, we have a single neuron, a motor neuron, and it goes to 2 muscle fibers. So when a nerve action potential goes down that motor neuron, it's going to cause 2 muscle fibers to contract. But then look at motor unit 2. A single action potential going down that neuron, notice that makes neuromuscular junctions at 3 different muscle fibers. So now a single action potential will cause 3 muscle fibers to contract. Now, is that really going to be a huge difference between 2 and 3? No, it's not. But the diagram here, the illustration, just has to be simple enough to show. In reality, it's a difference. That's called a motor unit, each one of those. So in this case, one motor unit goes to 2 muscle fibers. The other motor unit, number 2, goes to 3 muscle fibers. In reality, the difference in the size of the motor units is anywhere between like 10 and 1,000. So in some cases, an action potential will cause 10 muscle fibers to contract. In other cases, a single action potential will cause 1,000 muscle fibers to contract. So the size of the motor unit can make a huge difference. Generally speaking, what your body does is it recruits small motor units first, then larger motor units as you need more and more force. It makes sense to kind of like underestimate it first. Otherwise, you would go to pick up some small thing and you would go, whoa, you'd be off balance because you'd use a huge amount of muscle force. And, I'm sure you've done that. You went to pick up something that turned out to be lighter than you thought it was going to be. And you're like, whoa, you lose your balance and everything. Yeah, so your body, to try to prevent you from looking like a dumbass, you recruit small motor units first, And then if you still can't, pick it up, lift it, whatever, move it, then go to larger and larger motor units as time goes on. That's called recruitment. So you recruit more and more motor units as you need it, okay? So a motor unit is a somatic nerve, and the muscle fiber it innervates anywhere from 10 to 2,000, I guess. I think I said 10 to 1,000. So, but hopefully you can see then, again, a small motor unit, a single action potential activates 10 muscle fibers. A large motor unit, a single muscle fiber, activates 2,000. So muscles that control, do all muscles have equal numbers of the same sizes of motor units? No. Muscles that control fine movements tend to have small motor units. Muscles that control powerful movements have large motor units. So think about your quads, like the vastus muscles. Those are the ones used for jumping and running and stuff. So those have huge motor units. On the other hand, think of the muscles that move your fingers. You do fine, precise, delicate things with your fingers. So those muscles tend to have small motor units. All right, so once again, just to summarize quickly, there are 3 ways of controlling muscle tension. At the level of a single muscle fiber or cell, it's the number of action potentials per second. All right, more action potentials per second creates more tension. Then at the level of the whole muscle, it's the size of the motor unit, and then the number of motor units that are called into action, which is called recruitment, okay? Generally speaking, your body starts with small motor units and it only uses a few, and then as you need more and more force, like you're trying to push somebody's car, you keep recruiting more and more motor units, and you keep recruiting bigger and bigger motor units, until finally you say, it's your car, damn it, you move it. I'm going to go have a beer. So here you can see, just to try to show motor unit 1 recruited small fibers. If that doesn't do the job, then go ahead and get motor unit 2, medium fibers, and if that still doesn't do the job, go to motor unit 3. Eventually you get enough force to do what you're trying to do. So in order to talk about the wave summation, let's look at a basic what's called a twitch contraction. So contraction of all fibers in a motor unit is called a twitch contraction. A single action potential causes a twitch contraction. So look at the diagram. Think about it. From the time I decide to move a muscle, I decide in my head, in my brain, I'm going to, flex my arm, my forearm. Well, once I decide to do that, think about what has to happen. An action potential from my brain goes down my spinal cord, goes out along a spinal nerve, gets to the neuromuscular junction. We have to release neurotransmitter. It has to cross the synaptic cleft, bind to the receptor, has to open the ion channel, create the muscle action potential, which then runs along the sarcolemma, goes down the T-tubules, runs alongside the terminal cisterns, opens the calcium release channels. Calcium flows out into the sarcomere, moves troponin tropomyosin out of the way, myosin head grabs actin filament, and finally we start the power stroke. All those things had to happen, and it doesn't take very long, but it does take a finite amount of time. So that's what we see in the latent period on that diagram. From the time you decide to move a muscle, it's actually several milliseconds until the muscle actually starts to move. And then notice on the upslope there, the contraction period, as more and more myosin heads grab the actin filaments and do the rowing motion, we generate increasing amounts of contraction till we finally get the job done, whatever it was we wanted to do. Then bit by bit, those myosin heads have to start, detaching, and so we get the relaxation period. The muscle then kind of comes back down to normal again. This is called one twitch contraction. That's what's going to have to happen. The latent period, then it contracts, and then it relaxes. So during the latent period, calcium released from the SR. During the contraction period, myosin binds to the actin. During the relaxation, myosin has detached, calcium pumped back. Just what I was saying before, okay? And then there's actually a brief period of time called the refractory period when the muscle can't contract again immediately. We'll talk more about that idea when we get to the nervous system. But take a look here. This is what we were talking about at the beginning. The twitch contraction and the wave summation. So successive action potentials can add together to produce stronger contractions. So look on the left-hand side. You see on the bottom the blue are the action potentials, and then on the top the red are the actual muscle contracting. So look at a single twitch, a single action potential causes one twitch contraction. But then look at B, wave summation. What happens here is you get an action potential. It causes the twitch contraction. But while the muscle is still in the relaxation phase, the second action potential shows up. And therefore it builds on the first one, okay? And so then you create additional force of contraction. That's why the more action potentials per second, you can see once you go to C, unfused tetanus, a bunch of action potentials in a row cause a more and more powerful muscle contraction. Till finally over at D, fused tetanus, this is where you can't even detect individual twitches anymore. This is where the muscle is basically maximally contracted. This is called wave summation. When a muscle fiber is stimulated at a rate of 20 to 30, it can only partially relax. When it produces a twitchy, sustained but twitchy contraction, known as unfused or incomplete tetanus. And then, whoops, I talked over the transition, sorry. When a muscle fiber is stimulated 40 to 100, it can't relax at all. That's fused or incomplete tetanus. Individual twitches cannot even be detected. So once again, that diagram from left to right shows exactly what we were talking about before. That can lead quickly to fatigue if sustained. So yeah, that's what, like sometimes you try to, I remember that I had this teacher in elementary school. One of the punishments she would give us is we would have to stand there and hold, like something heavy at arm's length. And you can only do that for a certain period of time until finally you just can't do it and your arm, comes down. You just can't hold it up anymore. That's what's going to happen when you try to do that fused tetanus. You just can't maintain that for very long. Eventually you just burn out, and you have to the muscle fatigues and you have to stop the contraction. And finally, the word tetanus, you've seen the word tetanus before and you just saw it used again. You're thinking, whoa, wait, what? When you contract muscles, you have a disease? No. The word tetanus simply means a sustained contraction of skeletal muscle. That's really where the word started. That's where it comes from. It can also refer to the disease, sometimes called lockjaw, caused by an infection with Clostridium tetani, a gram-positive anaerobic rod-shaped bacterium. Remember, botulinum toxin was Clostridium botulinum. This is Clostridium tetani. Those Clostridium, damn, they are nasty damn bacteria. Notice the ones that you get in the hospital, those of your PCAs and PCTs and CNAs, rather. Sorry, just created a new occupation. Clostridium difficile, C. diff. Those Clostridiums, those anaerobes, they are nasty and they smell bad. But bacterium, when you get the disease tetanus, Clostridium tetani, it produces tetanospasmin, which blocks inhibitory synapses which regulate motor impulses. So what happens is it leads to sustained muscle contraction, hence the name. And the classic symptoms include what's called the sardonic smile and a rigid arched back. So you see in the bottom right those little tennis rackets. Those are individual Clostridium tetani. And people with tetanus, what happens here is that the it makes all your muscles try to contract simultaneously. And the muscles on your back and your gluteus maximus and so on, those are the biggest, strongest muscles, latissimus dorsi, in your body. So they kind of overpower everybody else, and you end up with this big rigid arched back. That's someone who's dying of tetanus, is what you're seeing in that picture, okay? So this was a kind of a long PowerPoint. We talked about a lot of stuff, so go back and review it again.